Welcome once again to the Niles S&A Silent Film Museum's Tribute to Al Christie. In this section of the pre-recorded Zoom meeting, Sam, Steve, and I talk about the films that are being shown on Saturday, March 20th. Hope you enjoy it because they got some more great stories.
Hiring things like pruning the movies.
Mm-hmm.
Because they're making fun of that censor, Major Funkhauser, who was the big censor in Chicago. I think they call him Major Bunk or something in pruning the movies.
Yeah.
He has that group of blue noses and they go to the screening room, the studio screening room, and say, oh no, you can't have cocaine, you can't have knives, you have to have flowers instead of knives. But Funkhauser was a real pain in the side of the studios because, he would hold up the release of films in Chicago, which was, a major city. And he sort of ruled the roost there. So I think it's just really great that Nestor decided to make fun of it. That they'd say, we're gonna poke fun at this guy. He's such a pompous, he was a bit of a pompous ass, Funkhauser.
Universal then turned around and denied that it had anything to do with him.
Yes, right. Well, of course, yeah, they're gonna cave. But somebody decided that they were gonna make fun of him, and really do it. And then, of course, the studio had to say, well, we're not really. It's fictional.
Yeah. Colonel Bunk, wasn't that it? Colonel Bunk.
Colonel Bunk. And they're in the review, though, they say Colonel Bughauser.
That's what I thought.
I read a review where it said Colonel Bughauser, but I bet when they were making the titles, they thought, that's too close. That's too close to Funkhauser. There's no way we can get this past him, no way we can say it's not him. So they probably toned it down.
Well, I wonder too, if you had the same reaction of a rather brilliant and unusual way that they presented their story, because you have these blue noses, with Bunkhauser, we'll call him Bunkhauser, gathers all these, narrow-minded people to go with him to
the screening,
the screening room, which is really kind of the way they really did do those in these cities, is they had their own screening room, no audience. So, they can be reacting in a certain way that the audience they'd be laughing.
Exactly.
Going, oh,
they're not
terrible.
able to gauge how an actual audience would react from their own kind of thing.
But what I found is unusually interesting about that film is they're saying, well, that has to go. And so what you've seen, which is kind of a dramatic scene, now is watered down and lily white and silly or
ludicrous.
whatever. I think Lee Moret, I think, has a knife and he's going like this, and they say, oh, no, that'll never do. And then he has a rose. It looks like a flower.
It's a flower.
You're going to go shoot a flower at somebody,
And the cocaine, they said, no, it has to be prunes.
This whole prune thing.
The prune thing is funny.
And at the end, it ends with a huge vat of prunes, apparently.
Well, I think they're alluding to these blue noses are constipated. They're emotionally constipated people. So I think that's kind of where a lot of the prune symbolism comes in,
Yeah, I think, it's interesting how the trade magazines sometimes would pick up on those things and sometimes they wouldn't.
Yeah.
And there was always a war going on. Is the reviewers would like to say things where the editor might say, I can't print that.
Yeah. Why did Christie not like slapstick? Any idea?
That's a very good question.
I don't think he ever said why, but boy, it's evident from the very beginning that he liked youth and youthfulness, and he thought, and he like a lot of his films were set in colleges or collegiate. A lot of them had
about sororities and that kind of thing,
and fraternities, or in some of the films, I forget which one it is, where we have all the guys, I think it's Mr. Fatima, where there are all these guys at the theater, and it's kind of like, well, who are they? Look like fraternity brothers, because they're all, making over how funny this guy in drag is, who's Eddie Barry. And at first I thought, well, who are these people? I don't get it. And then I thought, well, it doesn't really make any difference. It turns out I think they were fraternity brothers, or at least pals, but they certainly seem to be collegiate,
Yeah.
And sometimes in Christie films, you're not quite sure who's who. I mean, like the guy, I guess he's a fire marshal or something that keeps going to blow out the light that.
Oh, yeah.
Eddie Barry, I mean, there's about 5 minutes of film, where all Eddie Barry has tried to do is to light his pipe, and you have this weird guy that keeps blowing it out. And then I think at one point he just kind of, at one moment he blows it out himself. It's like, it's going to be blown out anyway. And, but it's fun how Christie, although he emphasized the story in his film, sometimes there's not much story there. Do you think? I mean, it was an excuse to have these people, but I'm trying to think about the slapstick.
Well, I know,
I don't know.
People would be interviewed later where Billy Rhodes or Betty Compson and Laura LaPlante and people they would talk about, and Babe London too. They talk about working at Christie. Oh, well, we didn't do slapstick. We did this, we didn't, the Senate people, they would jump up in the air and they would react. Well, we didn't do that. And they almost had kind of a snobbish attitude about the fact that they didn't do slapstick. But, it's not entirely true, because especially in the 20s, there's plenty of slapstick. And the Bobby Vernon comedies almost looked like they could have been made by Max Sennett, the way he did the Smith family comedies. It's still Sennett, but there's a little more story. But they're not little sophisticated situational things. They're kind of slapstick comedies with Bobby doing a lot of physical action, jumping over counters and, the kind of things. I mean, Bobby was very agile. So he does a lot of slapstick in his Christie shorts in the 20s.
Yeah.
No, they just had this, Christie had the attitude that they weren't doing slapstick. I don't know.
In fact, I remember Dorothy DeVore in several interviews. She said, "Oh, we didn't." How would she phrase it? We weren't into that slapsticky stuff. Slapsticky stuff, and I had never heard the term slapsticky, but that was a pejorative term, I can tell you.
Definitely, yeah.
Oh man, it was like, oh no, we weren't into that. But the more Christie films I saw, I thought, well, I don't know how you can call. It's interesting. In his own memoirs, Max Sennett said that he was very inspired really by burlesque. That isn't mentioned too often. And farce, actually in almost every Keystone film, it says farce comedy. I mean, it's right up there on the screen.
That's true, yeah.
But he said that what he liked about burlesque was it was just so wild and crazy and exaggerated. And I thought, well, he loved a lot of things that Christie only up to a level, like Ford. I don't think Christie would ever have let Ford Sterling get by with those wild gesticulations. I think he would say, no, oh no, Ford, you have to go somewhere else. I mean, Ford Sterling was working for Universal, but in Sterling comedies,
he had his own company, company. Yeah.
And even that didn't pan out, and he went back to Sennett. And the thing about Sennett that is often forgotten is that a lot of people left Sennett but came back. And
Fred Mace.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A lot of them did. And Ford Sterling is one that's, I mean, boy, you would think maybe his tail would be up between his legs when he came back, but actually Santa said, no, we'll do you different. And he kind of spruced him up and gave him top hat and nice dress and all that.
Oh yeah, by the end of the time that Sterling's with Senate, like in things like Hearts and Flowers, he's very sophisticated. He's not doing the talking and the gesticulating and pointing and all that. He's playing it very sophisticated. He really developed, really changed his style.
And I think that opened up a whole new career for.
Well, that's why he became, big character actor in the 1920s in features, is because he changed and he was able to play characters.
It's kind of fun in the early 1930s when he had a chance to revert some to his original.
And you could get to hear his Dutch dialect,
yes, yeah,
like in Dutch... Keystone Hotel and stuff.
Yeah, what happened, unfortunately, to a lot of the Dutch comics, Dutch meaning really Deutsch comics, German comics, was World War I put the kibosh on a whole generation of Dutch comics. I mean, even famous ones like Weber and Fields, they don't do very much for a few years there because you couldn't go out on the stage without being pelted with fruit. Yeah. If you were doing Dutch comic, it's dead in the water. And I think for Ford Sterling Senate, there must have been some interesting conversations where Sterling would say, well, I'll come back and do that. And he goes, I don't think so. So I'd love to have been a little fly in the wall here.
Yeah, but they did, he did move with the time. He did change, which is a lot of people couldn't. They kind of kept doing the same thing, but Sterling actually adapted fairly well.
Yeah, I think it was Charlie Chaplin even, I think, said when he was working for Keystone, he said, well, the top comic on the lot was Ford Sterling, but so much of his comedy was in his dialect and sounds that he'd make, like little squeaky mouse sounds. And I thought, really? And, so I read that before I'd ever seen the early 1930s films. And then it's like, oh gosh, it's a whole nother dimension. It really is the Dutch comic aspect, which now in the 1930s, there was enough distance from the war. And
you could do it again. Yeah,
you could do it again. And so all of a sudden you had, but I tell you, if you look at Variety magazine for about 2 years, or the Variety Weekly, you see, go to the obituaries, it's like, oh, another Dutch comic commits suicide.
Oh no.
Oh, another week, another one. They were dropping like flies because all of a sudden, everything they had worked on for 10, 20, 30
their whole careers, right?
Gone. Because if that's really your shtick, that's what you do. And so,
well, you've got someone like, the Lou Unger.
Mm-hmm.
He was a German comedian on the stage. Well, he got out of it by working for Joseph Schenck. He ended up being Schenck's general manager, and he was a general manager on the Arbuckle films and then on the Keaton films. But I'm sure he made a nice transition there because he couldn't have kept doing the German act, during the war. So
Lou Unger is very interesting. Minta Durfee, that his name came up once, and she said, "Oh, I hate that man." And I was kind of thunderstruck because I thought, well, I mean, he was almost the guy behind much of the Roscoe Arbuckle, Paramount Arbuckle films. And I thought, why would
she resented that.
She resented, and so I had a chance once to actually say, well, why did you say that there's only one person that you really have disliked, and that's this guy? She said, because he came between me and Roscoe.
Right. She got cut out. She
got cut out. And I think Roscoe was kind of like, in a way, she was a difficult person. And I think in a way it was like, well, Mint, I'm really sorry, that, I'm going this way and you're going that way. And she, of course, even had her own company in Providence, Rhode Island. And
briefly,
Yeah. So she, capitalized on Mrs. Roscoe Arbuckle name, and she never dropped it. She used it.
Well,
all
I saw a letter. Somebody has a letter from Roscoe to Minta while she's doing that series, the Mrs. Roscoe Arbuckle series. And Roscoe says something like, I think you should be able to get by without using my name, kind of thing. And at first I didn't realize, what's he talking about? And then I realized, oh, that series, because they were so heavily Mrs. Roscoe Arbuckle. And he kind of called her on it in the letter.
Yeah, that's interesting. Because where you like the Sidney and Mrs. Sidney Drew, there he was happy to have as much attention given to his wife. In fact, an amazing amount of attention, because he said, oh, she's really the brains behind the outfit.
Yeah, he would say she writes it all.
She writes it. She's
really her, he said.
She's a creative when I just go do what she tells me to do, but which is, of course,
not true.
Not true at all.
No, they were a great team.
Yeah, but anyway. Sorry about that, Mike. I think there's going to be a lot cut out of this.
Mike, do you have another question, Mike, for us?
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about Lyons and Moran. They were working for Nestor, but they were really kind of bit parts. What made Christie put them together? Because they became a fantastic duo.
Yeah, they became really the most popular movie team before Laurel and Hardy. Really, and they were together for years. I don't know. They were working together at Nestor. They were both doing parts together, and they were thrown together all the time. And somebody must have said, "Hey, these guys really work well together." And then I think it probably was just kind of a slow process. I think it just kind of happened. And then all of a sudden they realized they would make a great team. And then, it got concentrated upon.
I mean, they made over 300 films. And, they broke up, 1921, 22?
21, yeah, they stopped. They finally started doing features for Universal. Mm-hmm. Did about 4 or 5 features. And I think they did very well with the features, but then all of a sudden it's like they weren't working together anymore. Lee Moran was making shorts for Universal for Century Comedies, and Eddie Lyons went off and started producing his own shorts. And then he started producing things with people like Bobby Dunn. And I don't think they ever really said why they split up. Huh. I've never seen anything.
I've never seen anything either on that. I think they had a chemistry from the beginning, because I forget who it was. I think it was Lee Moran who invited Eddie Lyons to leave Biograph and come to Nestor, because Biograph is one of the patents companies. And it's interesting that Lee Moran was already with Nestor by that time. And I've never found out for sure if they knew each other before that happened. But, there might have been kind of a chemistry from the get-go, because if Lee Moran is saying, oh, I want you to meet, Al Christie, and this, you'd love it here and all that. And that was, of course, in New Jersey at the time. In New York, I think they were, making films in both places. And so I have a feeling that they hit it off possibly as friends first. And like you were saying, Steve, there's the chemistry is really good. I noticed, I had seen so few of their films, Mike, until you got these films, with the Library of Congress, getting this great stuff that they had. I had never seen but maybe 1 or 2. And the more I saw in so many of the films that you have on 2 discs, a little picture there, is incredible. And I thought, well, no wonder people loved them. No wonder they made hundreds of films, because like you were saying, Steve, before Laurel and Hardy, right offhand, I'd have to really think about what other teams there were, but for that, in that time period, they're 19, 11, 12, 13, all the way to 21.
Yeah.
And their features did quite well. They did several. And so it does make you wonder. I don't know, maybe Eddie Lyons. I know Eddie Lyons always liked directing and writing.
Mm.
And so maybe but then again, when he formed his company, he was a star at first.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure what happened there.
And their later Universal shorts, they were directing, because it's, starting around 1917, 1918, it's directed by Eddie Lyons and Lee Moran. They came.
Yeah. Have you noticed when it became star comedies?
Yes.
There were some shifts that happened there, I think. I'm not quite sure how that happened. Star, I guess, was a new brand,
Right. I think it was a brand that was set up for them.
Right.
It was some arrangement
Apparently,
with
when
Universal.
Christie was decided to leave Universal and start his own, they were actually going to go with Christie. Christie took almost the entire Nestor troupe.
Yeah.
And Universal didn't want to lose their top comedy team, so that's when they offered them that they could produce, direct, and write their entire stuff. They were responsible for it. And
so they gave them their own unit. It was like their unit. So that was the deal.
Well, I'm convinced that they really liked their multiple roles there, because when they made so many films and they're so good and they continue to work well. There are some teams, and I won't mention any names, not Laurel and Hardy, I love them, but there are other teams where it's kind of like, yeah, I can see why they hated each other. When they're slap, and some of the
they didn't do that.
Slapping the other and hitting him. I don't understand that kind of comedy.
Heine and Louie.
Yeah, Heine and Louie. Oh, the first one, I thought, this is the worst comedy I've ever seen in my life. Jimmy Opry and Walter Kendig.
But what I noticed with the Lyons and Morans is I think they're very sharply observed pieces of life. I mean, they're really sharp little films. And Eddie Lyons is kind of the handsome leading man.
Mm-hmm.
And he's a little character, but Moran always plays the character parts. Like, there's the one, I can't remember the name, but Eddie's the son of the guy who owns a plumbing company. And the father wants him to start at the bottom. So he has to work with Lee, who's the old guy, the old plumber who knows the business. And he has to go out to the house with Lee showing him the ropes. So Lee's doing all the character stuff, but they play off each other so well. But it's often that Lee is the character guy, and he's more character looking because he's skinny and kind of gangly and, a little odd looking. Whereas Eddie Lyons was really handsome, like a handsome guy. But the combination, I think, worked really well. It was very strong.
Yeah, I noticed Lee Moran, like in Dan Cupid, a detective. He had some fascinating movements. I noticed that I don't even know how he does it, but sometimes he would flip himself up and down in, like, I don't know if it's a full 360 degrees. I think maybe it is, but he'll do it this way or he'll do it that way. And I thought, what did he just do there? And when he's like looking for Eddie, and they're putting on the same makeups, which is kind of an absurd concept, but pretty funny. I think that one works unusually well, that their Dan Cupid detective thing, because they're both sort of searching for each other, and Eddie gets himself into such a mess because he, for one moment he loses, then he reasonable thought and steals this woman's necklace, priceless necklace, so that he can give it back to her. I guess he thought, well, she never saw me, so I can steal it and then I can get it back and she'll think I'm the hero. And it's like, no, she saw you. She has a good description of you, Eddie. That wasn't too bright. So you have two pretty dumb people here. Which Eddie Lyons would often play the opposite. He was, more dapper and a little more intelligent and all that. And Lee was just so great in character roles. And I guess being the contrast, but if they needed to be, they could easily play partners if they needed to be. So
I think it's a real shame that none of those features exist. I'd love to see their features.
Yeah,
were well received, and I think they did well. I'd love, because I've only seen the shorts. And then when they split off and went their separate ways, they did well because Moran was an excellent character player in features. As some of the shorts he made for Century and for Educational, he went to Jack White and he made shorts. And there's one called Uncle and it's excellent. It's a wonderful. It's directed by Fred Hibbard. It's very funny. So he did well, and Eddie Lyons had that series, his own, that he produced, and those are very good. Some of those are written by Robert McGowan. Just in Time, Keep Moving, things like that. They were very, very talented guys.
Yeah, Bob McGowan's certainly an interesting figure. And early on, he was doing a lot of the Mr. and Mrs. Carter DeHaven films.
Yeah, he was writing their scripts. Yeah,
writing their scripts, and Charles Parrott was sometimes directing them. And
of course, that's how McGowan ended up at Roach.
Yeah,
because when they were putting the Our Gang together, Roach basically gave that to Chase, to Parrott, who was director general of the Roach studio at that time. Roach had the idea, the story goes, and gave it to Parrott and said, work this out. So he brought the people together, and one of them was McGowan.
Which was
worked with him before. And of course, he became the guiding light of the series for like 20 years,
Yeah, boy, was that a lucky break for Roach, I think, to get someone like Bob McGowan. I mean, the kids loved him. As far as I know, everyone loved Bob McGowan. He was just, like family to anyone that worked with him. But, Lyons Moran, I know one of the reasons Christie liked him so much is that they were a great training ground for young newcomers.
Oh, especially the comedians.
The comedians, and they were phenomenal, obviously. Yeah. Now, how and why?
That's
when we see behind the screen, you can see a little of that. I think is like, they all look like they're really enjoying themselves here.
Yeah, they look like they're having fun.
I don't think it's put on. It's interesting that there are scenes where Anton Nagy is at the camera. He's very short, so at one point he has to get a stool to stand on and to crank his camera. And there's an assistant, and the assistant has a slate. In those days, they weren't clapboards because they didn't have sound, so he didn't have to have the clap.
Right.
In sound films, you'll see them use a clapboard and they go clap because the editor has to have the sound beat right at that second. But so they just hold it up. Now, what's interesting is I wrote down the number that's on that slate. And I thought, I wonder if that's a real number. It is. It's the production number assigned to a film called Behind the Screen. That film was a Universal production. Some of those were newsreels or screen magazines or extras that were given to the theater, but that actually was that number, 4-digit number, is a Universal production number. And I thought, aha. So I think that's one reason why it looks so honest. That film, I don't think, the elephant pulling that odd little cart or something. Now that seemed a little odd, but maybe they filmed that because they really were using elephants that way. Maybe it's like Lemmy said, well, if we're going to have an elephant and it's just sitting around eating or standing around eating, use them for something.
Well, I'm working on a new Lame Brains and Lunatics volume. And one of the essays is on the animal stars.
Good.
So one of the sections has been on the elephants, because there were a number of them. Selig had Toddles, Universal had Charlie, and then they had Minnie, and Selig had Anna May. There were all these elephants, but I found a lot of items. They talk about Charlie was in one of the Tarzan films that Bill Parsons produced, the first couple of Tarzans. And there's articles about Charlie moving stuff around. He's moving the sets. They had Charlie do this. So they use the elephants as workforce as well as personalities on the screen.
I know in circuses, elephants were used in several different capacities.
They'd help put up the tent and things like,
Yeah, or take it down, because when you've probably seen there are like 4 or 5, 6 guys with sledgehammers, with the huge posts that had to go in for the really huge tents. That had to go deep into the ground. And so you'll see them all like going, like click, 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 like that around, they all know how to hit it, just all in sequence.
Yeah.
Well, to pull that up is a different matter, isn't it?
So they had to have the elephants.
They had to have it, really. They had to
wrap
have
their
elephants.
Trunks around it and pull it out.
And I've seen pictures of them, and they'll wrap their trunk around and pull it up.
Well, one thing though that's been interesting with some of the elephants, like Toddles and some of the young Charlie, were kind of temperamental, and sometimes in the middle of a scene, they'd grab their co-star and fling them. Like they talk about, there was a lake or something at Selig, and they would grab and they just fling them into the water, like in the middle of a scene. They just, and there's a little item about Charlie doing that to Augustus Carney when he was Universal Ike or something.
Oh, that's
so it really was something working with, because sometimes too they say that the elephants would just decide they're going to lay down in the middle of a take. And if you're riding on the back of this elephant, all of a sudden they go down and you've got to like hold on to the ears or whatever. A couple of the actresses talk about that. But I think we're digressing since Christie didn't use elephants. So
no, very rarely. I think you have elephant, but Lions Moran, boy, I wish I knew more about their working relationship. And
how I wish more of the films were around too, because really not that, and they made so many of those one-reelers, and there's not that many that are, the ones that are around are very good, but it's not a high batting average of survival, unfortunately. And that part of that's Universal, because their survival's not so good.
Yeah, there were so many Universal films that I would love to have seen, different series. And
the Timothy Dobbs series, Timothy Dobbs, That's Me, what the Carter DeHaven did. All of those are missing, like all 14. They were directed by Wallace Beery. And, he's an extra. He's trying to become a movie star, and I'd love to see that series, but none of them are known to exist.
The pictures I've seen all look really enticing. I think that's about all we have to go on sometimes now with Lions Moran and the other comedians that work at Universal.
Yeah.
It's, you have still photographs, great posters. Boy, they had some great artists working on their publicity materials, press books, very lively, beautiful posters, I think, for a lot of those films.
Yeah.
What's interesting? I just realized that I don't know if Lee Moran was already married, but it was while he was at Universal that Eddie Lyons met Virginia Kirtley.
Yes.
Who's, of interest to a lot of people because she was another writer.
That's right. She had been another Keystone leading lady.
Yeah, Keystone leading lady, a writer.
She became a writer. Yeah.
And so when you look at Universal giving Beatrice Van a chance, Beatrice Van was trying to be a writer for at least 3 years, because she had wanted to be, no one would let her be until she met Alan Dwan. She met him by feeling someone biting her ankle under the table at lunch at the commissary at Universal. And it turned out to be Alan Dwan on his hands and knees, came up. He thought she was so pretty. He wanted to introduce himself, but didn't know how. He was embarrassed, so he bit her ankle instead.
Really?
And they became huge friends. And he was stuck for a story. Beatrice Van also worked a lot with Lyons Moran. That's one reason I'm talking about Beatrice Van. But Dwan said he was stuck for a story and didn't know what he was doing. He says, "Do you have any stories?" And she said, "Well, yeah, I have a story." And she told the story of her life. That's what she told me. And he said, "That is good. Do you have that written down?" She says, "No." And he says, "Tonight, go home, write that down, bring it to me in the morning, and I'm filming it." And he did. It was called A Small Town Girl. I don't think it exists either, but it sounds like a marvelous film about a small town girl that goes to try and make it big in the city, but not from the Christie angle, which like Victoria Ford and Lizzie,
Yeah.
Because although Beatrice Van loved Louise Fazenda, which is interesting, she thought partly because Louise Fazenda could be have pathos.
Yes.
Well, it's very,
yes.
Her roles are very interesting because they're comic comedian, but there's a certain softness and beauty to them.
But she plays it so seriously too.
Yeah.
There's a lot of sympathy that she develops for that character.
Louise Fazenda is another one who was at Nestor and at Joker. He made a lot of films at Joker, and of course, Sylvain Desjardins, who later changed his name to Bobby Vernon. I don't know why he would change it to Bobby Vernon, Sylvain Desjardins, but he was working also on the Universal lot. I mean, when you think about 1913, especially like you have, Lyons and Moran were working there. Bobby Vernon, just as a kid, but he had come from the stage, and his mother, Dorothy, is everywhere in these films. I think every other film that's on our museum website.
Yeah, certainly the Christie too, the Christie product. Once Bobby was a Christie, she's in every film practically.
And sometimes when he's in drag, he looks just like his mother, which is, everyone notices that. They say, "Oh my gosh, she looks so much like
just her. Like her." Yeah,
just like her, And so they had great resemblance. Max Asher, who I don't know if he worked some with Lyons and Moran, but he was a star of his own Joker series. And let's see, I was just thinking, Lon Chaney, actually, talking about newcomers, Laemmle liked to have newcomers work with experienced people who knew how to teach them, who would be patient enough to let someone make a mistake and say, "Well, you might want to think of doing it this way." And Lyons and Moran had a reputation for being great to work with. And that ran through the whole industry. I think.
They kind of started Babe London, she said, that she got a couple of roles working with Eddie Lyons and Lee Moran when she was really trying to break in, like 1918.
Well, Dorothy DeVore, who became a major star.
That's right.
She said, "Oh, it's Lyons and Moran, Mike." That she said, "They're the ones that really gave me a chance to, because she was experienced too, and could have played different kinds of roles, but they were gentle and yet firm, both, because they wanted you to succeed. So they didn't mind you getting a little attention. Like Victoria Ford's very interesting to watch her, I think. She can mug if she is expected to, you know.
Right, like as Lizzie, because she's playing the country girl, kind of goofy country girl.
But she also could just stop and look really pretty. So it's funny. She had kind of an odd mouth,
Well,
and teeth, and her eyes.
She's a little wall-eyed.
Well, little wall-eyed.
Little
Did you notice
wall-eyed,
that,
the one
Mike?
eye,
Just a little.
especially in stills, you can see it more. When she's moving, you don't really see it, like when you see the film. But often in stills, you'll see but I think it gives her kind of an interesting look. It makes her, and it helps for comedy a little bit, I think, because it looks a little off kilter, which I think is kind of funny.
Too, in Mr. Fatima, there's a very, very odd thing that happens in that film about a third of the way in that lasts for just that third, and then it goes back to a different Eddie Berry. You have Eddie Berry in drag a lot, and then you have him as Harold Lloyd
With the glasses.
wearing horn-rimmed glasses and doing all these mannerisms that are Harold Lloyd mannerisms that were catching on to the public. And there again, I'd like to have heard the conversation between Al Christie and Eddie Berry. Is either Eddie, cut that out, or why don't you do, something like Harold? Okay, I'll put on the.
Well, then they had Neil Burns do it in the 20s. All of a sudden, Neil Burns, around 1924, starts wearing glasses, and he gets much more persnickety, kind of, a little more Harold Lloydish than he was before, where.
And I don't know how you feel, but I don't think it worked for Neil Burns.
Yeah, I don't think so
either. When he switched his character, and it's curious. All of a sudden, Jack Duffy is wonderful. He's blossoming out.
Yeah, and Duffy takes over the films.
He takes over, and all of a sudden, Neil's kind of pushed to the side. And
it's true.
And Neil Burns, who's another person I had the good fortune to visit, he said, "Oh God!" And then when Christie sold out to Paramount, he said that was the end of me. And I found that very interesting to have him explain that. And what he said was, and I think part of it was Al saying, "Well, put on the spectacles and be a little bit of a fuss budget or something," and it didn't fit Neil Burns. When you see the film Foolproof, it's kind of like, wow, he could play very serious drama if he had wanted to. He could have been just like Harold Lloyd in some of his Keystone films. I mean, in the one where he plays the thief, is played straight drama. And when you see it, 1915, it's kind of like Ford Sterling said, "Well, you really should be a dramatic actor."
He said you should be like Bobby Harron.
Be like Bobby Harron. And it's interesting that some of the best comedians really could play straight drama.
One more film that we really haven't even mentioned was Rocking the Boat.
Oh, that's the Earl Rodney film.
Yes.
That's a wonderful. Steve, why don't you launch that? That's a wonderful film.
Well, I think it is. It's a very good film, and it's kind of a transitional film, I think, from the teens films to the 20s, because the teens films are kind of a certain way, and now we're moving into the way the Christie films of the 20s are. So I think it's kind of an important transition time, that 1920, 1921. Because he does move, and he kind of changes a lot of the performers at that point, because Bobby Vernon really takes hold, starting, I think he started around 1919, but then by 21, he's like probably the biggest star at the studio, and Dorothy DeVore is going to, be launched as one of the big stars, and Neil Burns. So it's kind of a transition period, and Earl Rodney's sort of the transition, because he wouldn't become one of the big Christie stars, really not one of the big stars. I mean, he did a lot of stuff, but he got more into writing a little bit later. He was, would go more behind the scenes.
Yeah, he was so often the leading man. because he was quite handsome, I think.
Yeah, he's very handsome. And he had worked at Senate and was in some of the triangle things too, that, that weren't Senate, that triangle keystones. He was in a lot of those too.
That's right. I'd forgotten about that. Yes, he did. He was pretty successful, I guess, by the time he came to Christie's. Now that you mentioned that.
Fairly well known, yeah. At least in comedy circles.
I think one thing that Christie was great, not only at developing female stars, but he was really good at finding kind of collegiate-like, youthful, handsome couple. Men, kind of like that little quote I read. He kind of wanted the youthful, the time when you're young in your life, and as Christie said, when there's nothing quite as funny as a young man in love. I think sometimes the young woman in love as well. As it can be terrible, or it can be quite funny or humorous. Rocking the Boat has an awful lot of things that I found of interest, Mike. Mm-hmm. For one thing, it's playful. I don't know of any Christie film that is almost tongue-in-cheek, silly, playful. It has a sweetness to it. It's silly, but it comes off. I've watched that several times, trying to figure out, why is this good? And why am I not put off? Because the whole concept of assuming that your wife's uncle is a captain of a ship, you have to theme everything in your house for his visit. Make him feel at home. So they even make salt seawater, which they're going to throw on him at nighttime. And they're going to rock his bed so it feels like he's on a ship. And they're going to have the maid and the butler in sailor outfits and do hornpipes. They play hornpipes. And everything is themed. I mean, they even have the steer, And it's so absurd. It's kind of like, well, this is so stupid. Why am I liking it?
Yeah, it works very well. Yeah,
I think it's the spirit of it. And it's interesting. I thought, who directed this? And it's Harold Bodine, of all people.
Oh, okay.
And I have a theory. Harold Bodine was William Bodine's younger brother. Mm-hmm. He looked up and admired his older brother. He came to live with him and became entranced and about films and filmmaking. And William helped to arrange for him to get into the film business. And Harold was still very young. And I thought there has to be a connection, I think, with Harold Bodine being given an early chance to make a film. And it's kind of like, well, this story is pretty ridiculous. I can almost hear him talking to his brother, Bill, say, Bill, this story is so stupid. I mean, how are you going to make it work? And Bodine had a great eye, too, for silliness. Bodine was also brilliant with children. Harold, not as much so, but in a way, they're behaving like children, I think, in a way. But as I watched it, I thought, well, everything they're doing, I mean, like the butler at first does not want to be a part of this, but the the maid is so convincing. He kind of realized, this could be fun, couldn't it? And the whole movie ends on the uncle finally being recognized for what he really is, that no, you can just be your normal selves, and I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, and they're only doing this because they think it'll make him happy. So the whole thing is they're trying to be accommodating to him and make him feel at home, even though they don't have to do that. you know.
That seems like an unusual theme to me, and I think that's what attracted me to that particular film. And it was nice to see Earl Rodney having a little bit more to do than he does in a lot of films. And I'm not sure we know who the actress.
Was it Helen Darling?
I think it's Helen Darling.
Irene Dalton.
Oh, Irene. Oh, she was, she was married to Lloyd Hamilton for a while.
Yeah, I'd forgotten.
She worked with him later. She worked with Hamilton in the early 20s, and then they married a little bit later. Briefly, they were only married like a year or something.
And everyone does a great performance.
Yeah, she's very good.
I wonder if the butler and maid were a vaudeville team. It seems
the way they worked together.
The way they worked, at the end, the uncle's there, and he now accepted as he is, and then you have the couple, and they're now normal. But what's interesting is the film kind of ends on their watching the maid and the butler doing a little sailor dance routine, but they don't have to. They're just doing it now because they realized that there was something very entertaining that came out of all this ridiculous, stupid stuff that they just did. And I find that a very unusual story. I think the writer was Robert Hall. I don't know really much about the writers except Frank Roland Conklin. We see his name. I think
Scott Darling sometimes.
Scott Darling too.
W. Scott Darling.
W. Scott Darling. I always love that. W. Scott. And Frank Roland Conklin, though, according to his widow, was actually Christie's story editor from 1918 to 1932.
Wow, long time.
And he was so prominent in other fields that not just, story and screenwriting, but other fields that he's in, like the who's who of American, who's who of businessmen. I mean, it's kind of amazing. In that, I thought, well, I think if he's taking credit for being the story editor for Christie from 1918 to 32, he really was. It's kind of hard to know sometimes who behind the scenes are responsible. Like at Hal Roach, we all know that when F. Richard Jones was there, boy, he made some definite changes. And when he left Senate and went to Roach, and then we see other changes. When other people come in, like Leo McCarey.
Leo McCarey took over, right?
I mean, the influence was huge. But Frank Roland Conklin, it's interesting. He wanted to be a writer, but really wasn't having much luck sending things off to be published, and no one wanted anything. And so Mrs. Conklin said, well, what happened was that he dropped off. He lived in Hollywood, and he would take his daily walks, and the walks would always go by the studio at Sunset and Gower. And he just thought, well, I'll drop off 2 of my stories here. And they accepted it. But, a lot of companies wouldn't care too much for submitted scripts, partly because of the liability, the legal issues, because someone will claim, well, they stole my idea. So they'll reject it immediately. Well, Christie somehow got him, or was recommended to him. He read them and liked them a lot. And he thought, well, who's Frank Roland Conklin? They said, he just came in, dropped him off, but he didn't leave his name. I mean, his phone number or address on them. So and in Hollywood, there was, there was no way to track down someone. And so he was walking on his daily walk. Christie saw him, leaned out the window and said, Mr. Conklin, I want to talk to you. And Conklin came into the studio. I'm telling this because can you believe that happening today? So he walks into the studio and he says, come into my office. He says, well, you have 2 stories here that were really good. We've turned them into films. And they're your stories. We'd like to pay you. What do you want? And he said, a job. And I love that story. And Christie said, you have it. And Mrs. Conklin said, do you know, from that moment, for all those years, from 1918 to 32, it was over a handshake. They never had a contract.
Wow.
And at the beginning of the year, they'd meet and say, okay, now what are we going to be doing this year? And so
That's
he
great.
could keep his salary, you know, going up and up and up and being appreciated and explaining what he would like to do. And I thought, you know, it's so rare to hear things like that, because unfortunately the paper record for most of these companies are long gone. Daryl Zanuck, I think it was Rudy Bellmer, had a horrible time trying to piece together his story because he didn't keep his files per se. They were spread all over the world. And so sometimes I've thought, oh, what happened to Christie's records? And there is kind of a funny upshot to that. And that'll bring in Dorothy DeVore if we talk more about Dorothy. But the only thing that the Christies kept much were these script files, which is curious because, you know, Mack Sennett also felt pretty much the same way as, well, my script files is the only thing that's really valuable. And so the Christies kept their script files. And when Al died, Charles inherited them. And then when Charles realized that he wasn't going to live forever, he thought, well, I got to find someone we can trust to keep all our files that we still have. And he asked Dorothy DeVore if she would keep them for whatever might be used for him. And so she took them, and she felt quite a obligation there. And so when I was meeting with her at the Motion Picture Country House, I asked a few questions. She said, boy, you'd have to look under my bed for that. And I said, what would I be doing under your bed? She says, well, that's where the scripts are and the synopses for all the Christie films and all that. And I could hardly believe what I was hearing. And so I got down on my knees in Dorothy DeVore's cottage under her bed. And so when I tell people that I've been under Dorothy DeVore's bed, you know, it's kind of like a Christie comedy. It's kind of like, you know, the guy has to hide now because the husband's come home, you know, the big bruiser husband, usually Eddie Baker. So, you know, so I'm pulling him out and it's unbelievable. It's kind of like, oh my God, Dorothy, what do you think I should do with these? And I said, give them to a good library like the Academy, you know. And she goes, well, I don't know about that. What I didn't know is what she meant by I don't know about that, is she wanted to be paid something. And I never thought about that. And also the Academy didn't authorize payment for collections because they made early on, they said, Sam, you can't offer any money because how do you put a price on Gregory Peck's entire life? You know, or any of these people who, you know, are the famous people and everyone else. We can't pay. So I was never allowed to pay a dime. But what I didn't know is Gene Gressley of the University of Wyoming, who had a record of everyone's birthday out in Hollywood, and he would come out to Hollywood and take you out for your birthday celebrations, you know, treat you to a wonderful meal and everything. He did that for a bunch of people, including Dorothy DeVore. And she says, well, you know, I have a lot of scripts here. I don't know what, but I want something, you know. And he says, well, what do you want? What are you offering? He said, $200.
Dessert.
Oh my God. And
Wow.
so when I found out that for $200,
Wow.
for $200, the University of Wyoming, which is where they are now, I've gone and looked at them.
Wow.
All that survived from the Christie's estate relating to their film business, which are mostly scripts and sometimes kind of interesting sets of synopses, including something that relates to a question or point you made, Steve, and that is for gaiety and vanity comedies.
All right. Yes.
I'd always wondered if those were Christie made.
Yeah, I think they were just sort of brand name.
I wasn't sure who was really behind those, and I thought, well, the Christies were behind that. I don't think there was much on Strand, but
No.
but anyway, I thought $200. But anyway, they're wonderful there. It's funny though, when I asked if I could come see them, I stayed with my brother, who's a professor there at the university, retired now. And so I stayed with him, and I went out there, and they said, well, we have everything ready for you. And they had them all on book trucks, three book trucks, I think, were filled. And I looked around in this gorgeous, huge facility, which was their reading room and study center and library. And I was the only person in there. Because people have said, well, what are all those collections doing there? And I said, well, sitting in warehouses mostly, to be honest. But anyway, the thing though is that Wyoming did bring in people to really, to first catalog everything that they had, and then to zero in on things. And so if you ask for a collection, they would get it ready for you. So I have to give them credit for that. But when I learned that it was for $200, I thought I would have paid $200 just to get it to the Academy, by that time. So that's it. But I think there's something telling about that they chose Dorothy DeVore. Dorothy, which we can talk about more in the next Zoom, if anyone wants to listen to it by that time, is Dorothy became enormously important to the Christies. And, from the get-go, when you see her, she had a perky personality, I think.
Oh, yeah.
And boy, photogenic. She really comes across. But she had a brain, a good one, and good judgment. She later in life became a little critical about, I was a star and the rest of you weren't.
Oh.
And so Babe London who absolutely adored Dorothy, after a few years of living together out at the Motion Picture Country House, I said, well, how's Dorothy? And she said, I don't know. And I said, oh, is there something wrong? Well, let me tell you, and I got an earful of that. Babe felt that she's being high-hatted and that Dorothy was looking down at her. And by that time, she was saying things like, well, the Warner Brothers wanted me to star with a dog. Me, Dorothy DeVore, a dog? Rin Tin Tin, who she was talking about. And so, when I first met her, she didn't talk like that. She was happy, everything. And she actually gave some wonderful interviews, fortunately. So there are some great interviews, but it's funny how, when you're living in a group setting like that, like the Motion Picture Country Home, that there can be the personality conflicts. And the eating area was all together. Now, what was kind of nice is that any of them were allowed to invite anyone they wanted to, as long as they were in the office was informed, and that you would sit with that person and you wouldn't bother other people. I wouldn't bother other people by saying, hey, isn't that Chester Conklin over there? Isn't that? And so that's how I got to meet Fred Neumeier and E. Mason Hopper and a whole lot of people who were out there at the time. It was great. And Dorothy DeVore when she first came, and Babe was already out there, but Babe was also very good at sharing her address book. And I said, you seem to have more current addresses for the old timers than anyone. She says, well, I take it with me to all the funerals I go to. And I said, well, that's kind of sad. And she says, oh, that's the only time we get to see each other. And old timers do often say that. That's as true
Yeah.
today as it ever was. It's like, yeah, I only see him at funerals, but I thought it was interesting to see some of those changes. But I guess considering the fact that they were all living in a small area, and one problem, especially that someone was out there I wasn't able to meet, was Dot Farley.
Hmm.
And Dot Farley was so important to cinema history that the problem was they thought she was not all there. And so she was in a more higher care setting, and they wouldn't let anyone there but family, but she had no family. And I tried to get in to meet her, and they wouldn't let me. And Babe, I said, they won't let me in there, Babe. And she said, you know what they don't understand is that they say she's cuckoo. But Dot always was cuckoo. That's maybe where I'll end my comments.
I think, yeah, that's a good place to end, I think, the first part.
Because after all, anyone who's this interested in Al Christie and Christie comedies, come on, we all have to be a little cuckoo.
That's right. Good place to end.
Like I said, I had a blast sitting down and talking with Sam and Steve. If you haven't seen the first section, please go back and watch it, where they talk about Al Christie quite a bit. And make sure you catch the live Zoom meeting Sunday, March 21st at 5 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time, where we'll talk about the 6 films being shown on Sunday, and who knows what else we'll end up talking about. With Sam and Steve, you never know. Bye.